In the grand empire of ancient Persia, a soldier named Mithridates made one fatal mistake, not on the battlefield, but with his tongue. He killed a prince, not just any prince, Cyrus the Younger, the rebellious brother of the king. In doing so, Mithridates helped end a brutal civil war, but what should have made him a hero turned him into a walking dead man, all because he spoke too proudly about what he did. Persian kings were not just rulers. They were seen as chosen by the gods. Every word they said was law. So, when the king claimed he killed Cyrus himself, nobody could say otherwise. It was part of his royal image. He had to be strong, divine, and unbeatable. But Mithridates, young and proud, couldn't stay quiet. He told anyone who'd listen that it was his spear that brought Cyrus down. He described the moment, the throw, the fall. He laughed, he drank, and he kept talking. At first, the king rewarded him. Gold, titles, public praise. But the king was also listening. And the more Mithridates bragged, the more dangerous he became. To call the king a liar, even by accident, was not a small thing. It was treason, and treason demanded punishment. Punishment that would echo through the ages. So the king made a decision. Mithridates would not just die, he would be erased, humiliated, and tortured in a way no one would forget. The method chosen was called scaphism. The Greeks gave it that name, but the Persians, they used it to show what happens when someone questions power. 2 wooden boats, milk, honey, and slow, slow death. It wouldn't end in a day or 2 or even 10. It would drag on for 17 days. Every hour a new kind of pain. Every moment a warning to the rest of the empire. What did they do to him? How did they stretch death across more than 2 weeks? To know what happened next, make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss what comes after. The punishment began with a strange preparation. Mithridates wasn't tied or stabbed. He was fed. Gallons of milk and honey were poured down his throat, far more than any human could digest. He was forced to drink until his stomach swelled and cramps took over. But this wasn't a last meal. It was the start of the torture. Then came the boats. 2 wooden pieces shaped like shallow canoes. One placed below him, the other above, sealing his body inside like a coffin. Only his head, hands, and feet stuck out. He couldn't move. He couldn't fight. He could only lie there as the real horror began. The milk and honey he drank began to rot inside his belly. He started to vomit and lose control of his bowels. Filth filled the small space between his body and the boat walls. That was exactly the plan. The stench and waste would attract insects, flies, wasps, beetles, and worse. And on the outside, it got even crueler. His face, hands, and feet were smeared with more milk and honey, sweet, sticky, and shining under the hot Persian sun. It didn't take long. Flies landed first, buzzing and crawling across his skin. Then came the biting bugs. Some drank from his eyes. Others laid eggs in his nostrils. The boat was placed on still water, maybe a swamp, maybe a pond. Somewhere humid, where the air was thick and full of disease. The smell alone was unbearable, but Mithridates couldn't turn away. His head was locked in place. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't swat the bugs. He could only scream, and after a while, not even that. The sun burned his skin during the day. At night, cold winds cut through the wet wood. His body swelled from the heat and filth. Insects now lived inside him, inside his mouth, under his eyelids, between his toes. They chewed through soft flesh, piece by piece. But the worst part wasn't the pain. It was time. Death by sword is over in seconds. Hanging takes minutes. But this was torture stretched across days, long, slow, waking days. He had no escape, no hope, and no way to die quickly. Still, Mithridates survived the first 3 days. The guards checked on him, maybe to feed him more, maybe just to watch. The empire wanted people to see. This wasn't just a punishment. It was a lesson written in flesh. By the 4th day, Mithridates' body had become unrecognizable. His skin, once whole, was blistered from the sun and chewed raw by insects. Maggots had started to appear, hatched from the eggs laid by flies inside his wounds, ears, and even his eyes. They squirmed and fed slowly, eating him alive while he was still conscious. He could feel them crawling, he could feel them digging, he could feel them feasting. There was no relief. Every breath he took brought more pain, more stings, more decay. His body, once proud and strong, was now a soft, swollen mass of infection and rot. The honey that once dripped sweetly from his skin had turned dark with blood. The water beneath the boat stank of death. It was filled with waste, sweat, and bits of his decaying flesh. His own filth soaked into his wounds, feeding the bacteria that were spreading through his blood. Fever gripped him. He shook with chills in the heat. He moaned without words. And still, the executioners waited. They didn't let him die. Each day, they returned to pour more milk and honey down his throat. They wanted to keep him alive, not to save him, but to stretch his agony. If he stopped eating, he might die too soon, and that would defeat the purpose. This wasn't about justice anymore. It was about making an example of someone who had embarrassed a king. The people who passed by would have seen him, barely human anymore. They would hear the buzzing of flies louder than his breath. His eyes were wide but empty, staring at nothing, while worms writhed in his cheeks. His tongue was swollen, his lips cracked and bleeding. Still, he lived. And with every extra day he survived, his story became more terrifying. The guards whispered about him. Maybe some felt pity, but none dared show it. To show mercy would mean sharing his fate. By the 7th day, parts of his body had started to turn black. Gangrene had set in. His fingers, once twitching in pain, were now stiff and crumbling. His feet, soaked and exposed, were bloated and cracked open like rotten fruit. And yet his heart kept beating. No one had expected him to last this long. But Mithridates, once a nameless soldier, was now becoming something else. A symbol, a warning, a cursed legend in the making. By the 9th day, Mithridates no longer screamed. He didn't have the strength. His voice was gone, stripped away by dehydration and days of moaning. The only sounds now were the soft buzz of flies, the quiet squirm of maggots, and the labored rasp of his breath. His body had become a shell, bloated, torn, and soaked in disease. His face was barely human. Swollen lips hung open. The skin around his eyes had peeled away from the endless attacks of insects. The stench coming from the boat was unbearable. Guards stood at a distance, covering their mouths, turning their heads. Still, they watched. Still, they waited. Because this wasn't just an execution, it was a message carved in pain. Inside the boat, his stomach had turned into a pit of rot. The milk and honey fed more than just disease. It gave birth to layers of bacteria. The heat baked it. The still water beneath turned warm and thick. Every breath Mithridates took dragged the scent of his own decay into his lungs. By now he couldn't move. He couldn't lift his head. His hands, once twitching, were motionless. But his eyes, those stayed open, and that was the cruelest part. He was awake. He was there. He saw everything. He felt everything. His mind was trapped inside a dying body that refused to shut down. The honey had long dried on his skin, but its work was done. His wounds were now infested with living creatures, worms, beetles, and larvae that treated his body like a banquet. The insects didn't just eat the surface. They burrowed into muscle, crept into joints, and nested inside him. Each night brought new suffering. The darkness offered no peace. Mosquitoes found him. So did night insects. Each one drew blood from places already bruised and broken. His skin crawled, literally. His ears buzzed from the inside, and above all, he couldn't die. Every hour that passed turned the execution into legend. People spoke of it in whispers. Children were warned not to lie or they might end up in the boats. Soldiers saw it and stood straighter. The king's message was clear. No man, no matter how loyal, could challenge the throne's truth. Mithridates had once been a hero. Now he was a lesson. And still, he breathed. By the 11th day, the pain had passed into something else. Mithridates no longer reacted to the stings or bites. His nerves had been so damaged, so overwhelmed, that his body stopped responding. But that didn't mean he was free. He was conscious, trapped in silence, in filth, in the slow unraveling of his body. The insects never stopped. Maggots moved deeper, reaching places no one could see. His tongue, once used to boast of his victory, was now swollen, dry, and bleeding. His eyes, still open, were foggy but not blind, and each blink, if he could manage one, dragged crusted blood across cracked eyelids. His hands and feet had changed color completely. Purple, then black. His nails had fallen off. Skin peeled away in layers. The limbs were no longer alive, just rotting pieces still attached. Gangrene had taken over, and the smell grew worse. Even animals that fed on the dead started circling the area, drawn to the stench of a man who was dying, but not dead. The sun continued its daily torture. The boat baked in the heat. The water below turned green and thick, buzzing with insects and lined with slime. Mosquitoes laid eggs nearby. Snakes slithered past. Nature didn't pity Mithridates. It fed on him. He had become part of the swamp. Each morning, guards would return with more milk and honey. They poured it down his throat even when he couldn't swallow. It spilled over his chest, soaking his open wounds. They needed him alive, just barely. This was no longer about one man. It was about what happens when someone threatens the king's image. In a land where the ruler was seen as a god, the truth didn't matter. Only the story did. And Mithridates had told the wrong story. He had dared to speak above his place. Now his voice was gone. Forever silenced. Not with a sword, but with 17 days of unending decay. No one dared question the punishment. No one dared speak his name near the court, but they remembered. They remembered the boat, the flies, the screaming, and the silence that followed. They remembered what happened to a soldier who confused pride with power. And somewhere, in the heart of the empire, the king smiled. His story safe, his lie protected, and his enemies warned. By the 13th day, Mithridates had become something beyond human. His body no longer resembled a man. It was a bloated, twitching mass, part flesh, part rot. His skin had turned to a patchwork of wounds, scabs, and open sores. The flies no longer needed to search for entry. His entire body was a wound. He had lost the ability to cry. His tear ducts dried out days ago. His breath came in weak gasps, shallow and slow. But his heart, somehow, still beat. And with each beat, the suffering continued. Beneath the boat, the water had turned black. It was filled with his waste, his blood, and the runoff of days of rotting. Bubbles rose slowly from beneath, carrying the stink of disease into the air. The surface buzzed with life, mosquitoes, gnats, and other insects drawn to the horror floating above. His mouth, once used for laughter and stories, was filled with rot. His tongue had swollen so large that it blocked part of his airway. He could no longer speak. He could barely breathe. His lips had cracked so deeply that the skin hung loose from his face. But it wasn't just the body that suffered. His mind remained. He saw things. Shadows, lights, ghosts of memory. Sometimes he whispered to people who weren't there. Other times he just stared into the sun as if begging for it to take him. But death still didn't come. The guards kept watching. They were under orders. Let him die too soon, and they'd take his place. So they checked on him, touched his pulse, and poured more milk and honey. Not because they cared, but because they had to. This was a ritual now, a performance of pain. And far away in the royal court, the story was already spreading. The official version told of a loyal king who defeated his wicked brother in battle. It spoke of divine victory, of royal strength, and it did not mention Mithridates, not once. His name was being erased. His body was being destroyed, and yet his punishment was remembered. The execution became legend, not because it was fair, but because it was feared. The people whispered about the man in the boat. They told their children to never speak against power. They said that lies could be forgiven, but truth could be deadly. Mithridates was no longer a soldier. He was a warning carved into time. On the 15th day, the air around Mithridates became thicker than ever. It wasn't just the heat or the flies. It was the weight of death circling, slow and heavy. Yet still, his chest moved. Barely. His heartbeat was weak, but it hadn't stopped. His body, ruined and hollowed, refused to surrender. By now, the insects didn't just feed on him, they lived inside him. Larvae had burrowed deep into his muscle, under his skin, and into every open cavity. Some maggots had eaten their way into the tissue of his cheeks and were now emerging through holes near his jaw. His ears were filled with pus and worms. His eyes were bloodied pits, clouded but open. His entire lower body was useless. Skin had sloughed off in some places. Flesh had liquefied. The wooden boat that once held his body was now soaked in fluids so foul, even carrion animals circled but didn't dare come close. No one touched him anymore. The guards simply looked. From a distance, they gagged when the wind shifted. His breath had become a slow hiss. His skin, once tight and sunburnt, now sagged and split. Infection had overtaken every part of him. Still, the ritual continued. A ladle of milk, a smear of honey, a duty carried out by trembling hands. Even the ones enforcing the punishment were traumatized by it. They couldn't forget the image, and they couldn't unsee what they had done. By this point, everyone in the region had heard the story. A soldier who spoke too much, a king who couldn't be challenged, and a punishment so cruel that it didn't even kill quickly. It waited, it watched, and it reminded everyone that in Persia, power spoke the last word. People from nearby villages came to look, from behind trees, from across the water. Some came out of horror, others out of curiosity, but all left silent. No one laughed, no one whispered. They saw what became of a man who dared to tell the truth. There was no dignity left, no hope. Just the slow death of someone who once believed his service would earn him honor. What he got instead was a coffin of wood, an ocean of flies, and 17 days of horror. And still, somehow, he was not dead. By the 16th day, Mithridates had become more corpse than man. His body no longer reacted, but his heart still beat, slow, faint, stubborn. His skin hung in loose patches. His face, swollen and torn, was now crawling with insects that no longer had to fight for space. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one like a dying whisper. His mind drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes his eyes followed movement. Sometimes they didn't. He couldn't scream. He couldn't speak, but he could feel. And that was the true punishment, feeling everything, even at the edge of death. The heat had blistered his head until the scalp peeled away. The exposed flesh turned dark, then green. Every part of his body had been broken down. Muscles eaten, skin shredded, bones pushed against torn skin. And yet, he lived. The milk and honey had stopped by now. Not because of mercy, but because there was no point. He couldn't swallow. He couldn't hold it down. When they tried, it simply poured out of his mouth, mixing with blood and mucus. There was nothing left to feed, only a body held together by pain. Beneath the boat, the water no longer moved. It was thick, almost solid, with waste and decay. Worms had gathered at the base. Leeches clung to the wood. And still, the guards came. They stood in silence, watching the final hours of a man who should have died days ago. No one dared report to the king that Mithridates still lived, because that meant failure, and failure in the eyes of the king could lead to punishment of their own. So they waited, and hoped, and feared the moment when they'd have to say, "He's still alive." Word had spread beyond the court, beyond Persia. Greek travelers, traders, and mercenaries spoke of the man in the boats. Some believed the story was too cruel to be real. Others believed it was proof of Persian savagery. But none could deny that the tale had power. And the king? He remained silent. His lie had worked. His brother was dead. His rule was safe. And the man who told the truth was nearly gone, broken not just in body but in history. His name faded, his voice silenced, but the pain he endured would echo for centuries. Mithridates, once a soldier, had become a myth. On the 17th day, the silence around the boat was complete. No guards whispered, no animals stirred, even the wind seemed to stop. Mithridates was still, his body unmoving, his eyes half closed. For hours, nothing changed, no breath, no sound, only the swarm of flies that continued their endless feast. And then, at last, his chest stopped rising. Death had come. Not with a sword or a scream, but like a slow, final breath slipping away. The man who once stood proud on a battlefield had died lying in his own decay, consumed by insects, drowned in silence. His final moments were not seen by kings or generals, but by the crawling things that had made his body their home. There was no ceremony, no burial. His body was not taken down or washed. The boat was left where it was, floating in filth, forgotten by all but the flies. Perhaps later they burned it, or pushed it deeper into the swamp. No one recorded that part. No one cared. But the story didn't end with his death. In the cities, people spoke his name in hushed tones. They repeated the tale again and again. A man who killed a prince, a man who spoke the truth, a man who was punished beyond anything the world had ever seen. Greek writers would later tell the story in vivid detail. They described every step, every wound, every day, every horror. They used it as proof that the Persians were cruel, that they were monsters, that only Greeks understood justice. But there was a problem. No Persian sources confirmed any of it. No inscriptions. No royal records. No Persian historian ever mentioned Mithridates or scaphism. The entire tale came from Greek hands, hands that had fought wars against Persia and had every reason to make their enemies seem brutal and savage. So what was true? Did Mithridates really die like that? Or was it a story? Part truth, part fear, part propaganda? Historians today still debate it. Some say the method was too detailed to be fiction. Others argue it was a Greek invention, a way to make Persians look like monsters. But one thing is certain. The story stuck. Even if it wasn't real, it felt real. It spoke to something deep in people's minds. The fear of slow, helpless death. The fear of speaking the truth in front of power. The fear of what rulers will do to keep their lies alive. And so, real or not, Mithridates' pain was never forgotten. Centuries have passed since the name Mithridates was first whispered in fear. Yet his story, whether truth, myth, or something in between, still haunts the edges of history. It's more than a tale of torture. It's a mirror reflecting the darkest side of human power. Scaphism, as described by the Greeks, remains one of the most horrifying execution methods ever recorded. But its very horror is what makes historians question it. Could any society, even one as powerful as ancient Persia, truly design a punishment so slow, so cruel, so methodical? No Persian law code mentions it. No royal decree describes it. The Persians, in their surviving records, speak often of justice, order, and divine rule. Their kings were seen as caretakers of balance, not wild tyrants thirsting for pain. That contrast raises questions. Why then did the Greeks tell this story? Perhaps to paint their enemies as beasts, perhaps to justify their own wars, or perhaps because deep down, people are drawn to stories of suffering. The more terrible the tale, the longer it survives. Even in modern times, the tale of Mithridates has found a place in books, films, and debates. Human rights activists use it to show how far cruelty can go when unchecked. Philosophers cite it when speaking about the abuse of power. Artists depict the scene as a symbol of tyranny. But maybe the story isn't just about Persia. Maybe it's about something bigger. About how truth is dangerous in the wrong hands. About how rulers rewrite history to protect themselves. About how the worst punishments are not just physical, but psychological, spiritual, and slow. Whether Mithridates truly suffered for 17 days in a boat, or whether he was a name invented to teach fear, doesn't change the message. The story warns us about blind loyalty, about unchecked power, and about what happens when a man's pride collides with a king's lie. In the end, what survives is not always fact. Sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's myth, and sometimes it's a voice whispering through time, not of a king, but of a forgotten soldier, eaten alive for telling the truth. If this tale moved you, remember to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell so you don't miss more stories like this. Stories that history tried to bury, but we're here to dig up.